Germaine Taylor. For a brief moment, Germaine Taylor was on top of the world. Bronze medalist at the 2000 Olympics, then undisputed middleweight champion in 2005 after back-to-back wins over Bernard Hopkins, he embodied the American dream. For a hard worker like him, nothing could have predicted the kind of nightmare that would take root in his mind. After several losses between 2007 and 2009, including a brutal knockout by Arthur Abraham, Germaine disappeared from the radar. He returned in 2014 in an improbable comeback and briefly became IBF champion again after beating Sam Solomon. But while he held up a belt on television, his personal life was collapsing into a spiral of uncontrollable violence. A few months later, Taylor was arrested for shooting a man at a barbecue. This was no accident, as he had pulled out a gun that day and shot his victim directly in the chest. And to make it worse, he remained calm until the police came to arrest him. Shortly after, he was arrested again for threatening a group of children with a gun. According to reports, he yelled at them that he would kill them all. No one really understood what was happening to him, but his eyes were empty and his face locked as if the man who once fought Hopkins no longer existed. Between 2014 and 2017, Germaine Taylor was arrested repeatedly. One time for hitting his girlfriend, another for destroying property in a fit of rage, and another again for violating probation. Each time the judges mentioned mental instability, and medical experts confirmed he was suffering from brain damage caused by the blows taken during his career. He was believed to be suffering from pugilistic dementia, but nothing stopped him. In 2017, a viral video showed Taylor naked, disoriented, and screaming in a hotel hallway. He was no longer a boxer, he had become a broken man. Years of war in the ring had left invisible scars, and no one seemed able to bring him back to the surface. The fans who once chanted his name no longer knew whether to fear him or mourn him. Trevor Bourbick. Trevor Bourbick is first and foremost a piece of history. Last opponent of Muhammad Ali and final heavyweight champion before the era of the 90s legends, he was the man who ended the icon's career for good. On December 11, 1981, at the Queen Elizabeth Sports Center in the Bahamas, Bourbick beat Ali on points in a sad fight where the former king was only a shadow of himself, and this secured him a place in the books. But no one was truly ready for the nightmares he would face. Born in Jamaica, he claimed to have received a divine vision at age 16, telling him he would become world champion. He left the country to train in Canada, rose quickly, and finally reached the top in 1986 by beating Pinklon Thomas to become WBC champion. It was then that he was dethroned by a hurricane named Mike Tyson, who knocked him out in 2 rounds in a display of violence that made headlines around the world. That fight would be famous, but it does not define Trevor Bourbick. What defines him is what happened outside the ropes. In the late 80s, he was arrested and convicted of raping a 15-year-old girl in Florida. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served only 15 months before being deported from the United States to Jamaica. That's where the real descent began. Back on his native island, Bourbick tried to restart his career, but his fights had no soul as he faced unknown opponents and lost multiple times before retiring without honor. What followed was a string of family conflicts, financial troubles, and erratic behavior that ended in brutal tragedy in 2006. On October 28, 2006, Bourbick was found dead in the courtyard of a church in Norwich, Jamaica. The autopsy confirmed it was a machete attack, mostly to the head. Police opened an investigation and arrested 2 men, his 20-year-old nephew, Harold Bourbick, and an accomplice. The motive was reportedly a land dispute, and the trial revealed years of resentment, unresolved tensions, and a rage that exploded that night in an act as senseless as it was savage. Esteb Jesus. In the 1970s, Esteb Jesus was a rising star. A fast, explosive, and technical Puerto Rican, he was best known for a unique feat. He was the first man to beat Roberto Duran as a professional. That was in 1972 in New York, in a fight where De Jesus shocked the world with precise boxing and a perfectly executed strategy. That night, he was untouchable, and at 21 years old, undefeated, and already an idol. But like in much of Latin American boxing at that time, the spotlight hid the shadows. Esteban was talented but fragile and surrounded by bad influences that led him to cocaine and heroin use. Early on, he sank slowly into a chaotic lifestyle lit only briefly by his victories in the ring. The most incredible part is that he won the WBC lightweight title in 1976, a flash of brilliance before the storm. After losing a historic trilogy against Germaine Jesus, became a second-tier boxer. He fought often, but no one believed in a real comeback as he kept taking heavy punishment in his bouts. In 1980, he retired without ceremony at just 29 and began to fall apart. On November 27, 1981, in a quiet suburb of San Juan, Puerto Rico, Esteban was driving his car when an argument broke out with a 17-year-old boy. Accounts differ on what was said, but the facts are clear. De Jesus pulled out a gun and shot the teenager, who died instantly. The boxer was arrested on the spot. After the trial, the former champion was sentenced to life in prison for murder, but the story did not end there. In prison, De Jesus contracted HIV and became one of the first high-level athletes known to be HIV positive. The news made headlines across the Spanish-speaking world, and the shock was enormous as boxing had never faced such a moral and physical tragedy. In the years that followed, Esteban changed. In prison, he became a born-again Christian and started preaching. He asked for forgiveness, gave speeches to young people, and slowly became a symbol of redemption for some, even though his body, already too damaged, developed full-blown AIDS and led to his transfer to a hospital. In 1989, as he lay dying, an unexpected figure came to visit Roberto Duran. The two former rivals reconciled, prayed together, and even cried that day, and just days later the Puerto Rican died at age 37, leaving behind a shattered family and a mourning nation. Anthony Small. Anthony Small could have become a respected figure in the noble art. British super welterweight champion, he won the belt in 2006 by beating Merdud Takalu. At the time, his style was elegant, his jab was fast, and his movement was sharp. He kept winning and even claimed the Commonwealth title. His career seemed promising, but soon another path emerged, and it was no longer inside the ring where he made headlines. Right after ending his career in 2010, Small radically changed his life. He had converted to Islam while still active, but after boxing, his faith took on an increasingly extreme direction. He began preaching radical Islamist ideas and joined ultra-conservative figures like Anjem Choudary, who was known for links to the banned group Al-Muhajirun. Small started posting videos in which he fiercely criticized Western democracies and even rejected UK law, openly calling for Sharia. In 2014, Anthony Small made national headlines when he was arrested for attempting to travel to Syria via Turkey, allegedly to join the Islamic State. He was charged with planning terrorist acts, and the idea of a former champion attempting to join ISIS sent shockwaves. Images of his arrest spread across the media, where he appeared in a jalaba with a closed expression denying any terrorist intent, but showing no shift in his convictions. The trial opened in 2015, and British prosecutors accused him of attempting to cross into Syria using false documents and participating in a recruitment operation. He was eventually acquitted due to lack of sufficient evidence, but the damage was done. His image was shattered, and his presence in Islamist propaganda videos remained a documented fact. Despite being cleared, Anthony Small remained under surveillance. He kept publishing extremist content and made public statements against British soldiers. He targeted national institutions and openly rejected anything not aligned with Sharia. These actions led to public bans in certain areas and turned him into a complete outcast. Scott Harrison. Scott Harrison was once WBO featherweight world champion. At his peak, he was seen as one of Scotland's toughest fighters. He had a high guard, a pressure-heavy style, and a warrior's mindset. In 2002, he won the belt by stopping Julio Pablo Chacon, and the UK finally had a champion who fought with grit instead of glamour. But behind that willpower, another force was slowly eating away at him. As his career progressed, the first signs of chaos appeared. He started missing weigh-ins and canceling fights at the last minute. In 2005, he was hospitalized for depression, and from that point on, his life spiraled downward. He lost his belts, but it wasn't defeat that shocked people, it was what came next. Harrison, drowned in alcohol, became uncontrollable and started committing violent acts outside the ring. The champion had become a public threat. In 2008, he was sentenced to 30 months in prison in Spain after assaulting 3 men, including a police officer, in a nightclub in Malaga while drunk. That night, he resisted arrest and knocked out a security guard. 2 years later, he was handed 4 more years for beating a woman in a bar, then attacking another officer from the Guardia Civil. His time in prison didn't change him. After a brief comeback in 2012, he was arrested again for public disorder in Glasgow, this time for verbally abusing police officers in the street. He tried to rebuild his boxing career, but violence kept following him. In 2015, he was jailed again, this time in Scotland, for violating parole, and made headlines again for his breakdowns, his rage, and his inability to stay out of trouble. Scottish police categorized him as a high-risk individual, and several women filed complaints of assault. One claimed he hit her in the face for refusing to hand over her phone, while another described being attacked in a taxi for no clear reason. Scott Harrison was never convicted of murder, but his name became tied to scenes of violence far beyond what boxing could excuse. His own father, Peter Harrison, who had been his coach and mentor, eventually cut ties because he could no longer follow the self-destruction of a son visibly in free fall. Today, Harrison lives in isolation and tries to put himself back together, but so far he hasn't made it. Ricardo Mayorga. Ricardo Mayorga was never a normal boxer. He entered the ring with a cigarette in his mouth, insulted his opponents at press conferences, and fought like there was no tomorrow. He shocked the world by humiliating Vernon Forrest in 2003 and becoming WBA and WBC super welterweight champion. But after boxing, he became even more violent. What once seemed like a show turned into repeated and dangerous real-life outbursts. In Nicaragua, his home country, Mayorga went from national idol to national disgrace. Right after his career ended, he plunged into cocaine and alcohol, and footage of him wandering the streets, shirtless, dazed, sometimes lying on the ground, became frequent. He was no longer the boxer who shocked to sell fights. He was now a man shocking the world with what his life had become. The Nicaraguan government eventually intervened, but he was arrested multiple times for public disorder and drug use. The worst was what happened in his private life. Mayorga was repeatedly accused of domestic violence. His wife, Maritza Olivas, filed several complaints accusing him of hitting her, threatening her, and destroying furniture during uncontrollable rage episodes. Police reports confirmed these allegations. In 2019, he was officially arrested after a violent altercation at home, during which he reportedly tried to strike her with a bottle. Several videos from these incidents went viral. In them, Mayorga is seen being escorted by police, often in a trance, unable to answer questions, yelling at officers or at cameras. In some clips, he rambles about past fights but appears completely lost, detached from reality. Local journalists like Miguel Mendoza and newspapers such as La Prensa published investigations on his mental state and the repeated violence he was allegedly responsible for. The Nicaraguan Ministry of the Family had to intervene. He was briefly placed in a public rehab center but was released without any real improvement. People close to him describe a man who is out of control, cut off from his children, rejected by his family, and in constant conflict with everyone around him. Even in Managua's gyms where he had made his name, he was no longer welcome. He reportedly assaulted a young fighter during training over a trivial issue. Vinnie Paz. For years, Vinnie Pacienza remained one of boxing's most beloved characters. A world champion in 2 weight classes, he was best known for his miraculous comeback after a car crash that left him with a broken neck. The world had watched him defy paralysis and return to the ring wearing a halo brace bolted to his head. It was the kind of sports story America loves to believe in. But what few people knew was that Vinnie Paz's life after boxing was far from a fairy tale. After retirement, the spotlight disappeared, and it was in the shadows that Pacienza became Paz. He was no longer the brave fighter. From yesterday, he became a man unstable and violent. In 2012, he was arrested for assaulting his partner. The incident happened at his home in Warwick, Rhode Island. When police arrived, they found a crying woman with visible bruises, and the official report stated that Paz had lost control and struck her several times after a fight over money. He showed no remorse as he was taken away in handcuffs under the flash of cameras. But that was not all. Vinnie Paz was also found guilty of violating a restraining order that prohibited him from approaching the same woman. Less than 2 months after being released on bail, he tried to contact her and showed up uninvited at her home in the middle of the night. Police had to intervene again, and he was taken into custody. This time, the charges started piling up and his criminal record began to grow heavier. It marked the start of a downward spiral where the name Pazienza became associated with chronic instability. What shocked people even more was how he acted toward law enforcement. In 2014, he was arrested again, this time for spitting on a police officer after being pulled over for driving without a license. The altercation escalated quickly, and Paz yelled in the street, insulted the officers, and resisted arrest. The incident was caught on a surveillance camera and broadcast by the local media. He was no longer the champion the public admired. He had become someone even authorities feared to handle. Testimonies from his former entourage were unanimous. Vinnie had become uncontrollable. Some of those close to him described him living alone in an empty house surrounded by memorabilia, talking out loud as if he were still inside the ring. In truth, he never managed to rebuild himself outside of boxing, and he let anger, paranoia, and aggression take over. Today, his name remains etched in the history of boxing, but also in the criminal archives of the state of Rhode Island. Roger Mayweather. Roger Mayweather was far more than a former world champion. He was the cornerstone of the Mayweather empire. A sharp and powerful fighter, he held WBA and WBC titles and became the iconic coach of Floyd Mayweather Jr., the man who shaped him, refined him, and guided him to become one of the most accurate boxers in history. Roger was there in the corner for every big win, whispering advice into the ear of the undefeated future legend. But behind this legacy was a descent into violence and demons that even fame couldn't silence. In the late 2000s, Roger began to fall apart. In 2009, he was arrested in Nevada after a disturbing scene. A woman was found beaten and bleeding in a hotel room, and she claimed that Roger had kidnapped her, beaten her, and strangled her for several minutes before she managed to escape. He was arrested immediately, and with clear evidence, he was charged with kidnapping and assault. The case made headlines and cast a brutal shadow over the Mayweather family image. This assault wasn't an isolated act. Since retiring in 1999, multiple reports mentioned street altercations, arguments with strangers, and violent outbursts over minor provocations. People close to him said he lived in constant tension with uncontrollable bursts of rage. He reportedly punched a man in a gym over a harmless comment and threatened another with a baseball bat over a made-up debt. His mental health seemed to deteriorate rapidly, and his behavior became dangerously erratic. Drug abuse was also at the heart of his decline. Roger was said to consume large amounts of medication and illicit drugs to cope with physical pain and inner torment. Despite everything, Floyd remained loyal to Roger, paid for his care, stood by him during treatment, and often spoke about the deep debt he owed to his uncle. But the myth of the mentor was fading. Roger was no longer the calm strategist in the corner. He had become the fragile shadow of a once glorious past. In March 2020, Roger Mayweather died at the age of 58. His body worn from years of war and his mind broken by darker battles no one could win.